Go ahead and take a seat. Oh, you already did. Well done, church. All right. Welcome for those of you joining here in person or online. Have you ever, in your experience in life, bumped into a rule, an expectation that maybe you didn't even know existed until you rammed right into it? Maybe this happened, you were traveling to a different part of the country or into a different family or into a different group of friends, and there was certain invisible expectations within that group, and nobody told you about them until you came crashing into one of them. I have a story like that when my wife and we moved to Mississippi so I could finish my studies down there. And living in Mississippi was a very different experience than growing up here in the Ohio Valley. I was down there doing my schooling, but I was also working with a church. Amy and I were both working with the youth group there at the time. Now, let me tell you a little bit of something about the South. So in the South, you just don't go to church on Sunday morning. That is not enough. So in the Mississippi, you go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and if you're among the faithful, Wednesday evening prayer study. Absolutely. So Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday night, every single week. So the Sunday evening service was kind of an interesting, more laid-back service. Originally, they had started Sunday evening services so people could bring their friends to church. I guess your friends who can't get out of bed early enough to get to the Sunday morning service. So either way, it was kind of a little more laid-back than the Sunday morning service, and we had attended that service. And unbeknownst to us, there was an invisible fence that we weren't, or actually, I guess, Amy wasn't aware of. And it had something to do with what she wore. So we were unaware of what this issue was until the very next day, the pastor of the church called me in and he sat me down and he said, "Man, I really hate to do this, but some of the ladies of the church got together." And this is how a lot of stories begin, right? Some of the ladies of the church got together and they saw that Amy wore shorts to church on Sunday morning. It was really more of a jumper suit, but we're not going to get into the details of that. And they were concerned that since she works with the girls in the youth group, she might be leading them astray in their modesty. And so I got run into this invisible fence that we didn't know was there regarding apparently what was appropriate to wear on Sunday evening service and what. And this was Mississippi, by the way, which is the world's hottest place on earth. But there it was. And maybe you've encountered situations like that as well, where you've run into an expectation that you weren't aware of was there, and until someone brought it to your attention and criticized you for it, or made you feel like you had stepped out of place because of it. And things like that can be very common sometimes in church. Maybe that's why some of you have gathered, because you've had a bad experience like that in church. And if you're wearing shorts right now, I just want you to know, you're okay with C3. It may not be very wise on the first day of snow in our valley to be wearing shorts, but you're okay with us. You're okay with us here. But a lot of times that happens in churches where our focus gets turned off of what the main things need to be. And instead of focusing on the main thing of our faith, which is Jesus, we end up focusing on these rules, on these fences that are used to determine what's right and what's wrong within our faith. And that's something that I'm sure it's common to happen in churches, but I think it's actually really common and happening a lot in our culture right now, where we're putting out these dividing lines, and by these lines, we're determining who who we can be friends with, who we can contact with, who we think is good or bad or in or out in our culture, and it's actually driving our culture further and further apart. And so I think we need to consider this concept, especially when it pertains to the church, and I want to do that by just helping us remember it through today's big idea. So today's big idea that we're going to try to summarize throughout my message is this, that as a church, our focus, not our fences, make Jesus church. What makes church, Jesus' church, his church, is our focus on him, not on some of these dividing lines that we have historically made, whether it's shorts or other issues that have come along in the past. And a lot of these fences, they probably started well-intended. I'm sure some of the ladies in this church in Mississippi, they had lived through some of the tumultuous times of the 60s where there was, all kinds of different viewpoints of what was modest and what wasn't modest. And so at some point in that whole upheaval time, they decided that the line was somewhere below the knee, that the fence was that shorts were bad, but I guess pants or skirts was good. And they held on to that fence because it meant so much to them. And then 30 or 40 years later, they were still holding on to that particular issue. And so I think this is a common thing that can happen for all of us, and that we lose our focus on Jesus and end up focusing on some of these fences. And it's an issue that can happen to the church today, and it's something that has been happening since the very beginning. Today, we are wrapping up our series called Above, rising to the Christ-filled life of the book of Colossians. And in this series, we've been looking at this letter written by Paul, who was one of the early church planners, to this little church in the town of Colossae. And he's writing this letter to them, even though he's never been there, because some false teachers have come into the church, they've infiltrated into the church, and they're telling them a different focus to be on instead of focusing in on Jesus. And one of those things that they want them to focus in is one of these fence issues. They want the church to start to follow the Old Testament law. And in particular, there was this requirement for those who were following God in the Old Testament to be circumcised. And this was a real big issue to determine who was in and who wasn't. And so we've been going through this series, and at the very end of it, Paul concludes this message in a way that I have never quite seen before. Now, I've been studying the Bible since before my days in Mississippi, and I've never quite seen the way that he concludes this letter in this particular way before. And I hope that I can help share some of that surprise with you in this message, but you're going to have to participate with me. And so I'm going to need your help for just a moment. I want you to pause for a second and answer a question for me. And answer this question honestly, and maybe write it down. I know you have some sermon notes pages in your bulletin, or just hold on to it so that you can remember it all the way towards the end of the message. But here's the question. What is the greatest threat to the church? So dig deep, think about what first comes to mind. Like, what is the greatest threat to the church? And either write that answer down or just hold on to it for a second and allow your expectations, like mine, to maybe be challenged by the very way that Paul ends his letter to Colossians. But in order for us to see the way that he concludes, I hope you don't mind, we're going to just walk really quickly through this letter that he wrote, see some of the major arguments that he makes as he's combating some of this false teaching that tends to focus on these fence issues, and then see how he brings it all together in one concluding verse, tying all of his elements together and making one final statement about the ultimate or the greatest threat to the church. So let's go ahead and take that quick walk through the book of Colossians. And if you've been with us throughout this series, you know that Paul begins his letter by showing the church that Jesus is their all, that he is above all, beyond all, before all, and so he is the one who is to be their focus. And he does that early on in chapter 1, verses 15 through 16, where he says this about Jesus. He says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him, by Jesus, all things were created, whether in heaven or earth, visible, invisible, whether thrones, dominions, rulers, authority. All things were created through him and for him. Now, here what Paul is stating is something that the church has always affirmed from the beginning, that this individual Jesus who the disciples walk the earth was more than just a mere man, that he was God in the flesh walking among them. And even though Paul's claim here seems somewhat through the roof, if you have questions about that, go and read some of the early stories about Jesus, what he did, and those are recorded in the Gospels, Mark, Luke, Matthew, and just hear the stories of what they witnessed and why they came to this conclusion very early on. A lot of times we think that the church, came to this idea about Jesus being this mythical God character as if it was some kind of like telephone game. You ever played a telephone game where I tell a story to someone and they tell a story to someone and they tell someone? We think that somehow it was only down through the ages of the church that they came up with this great idea that Jesus was more than a man. But right from the beginning, and recorded in this early New Testament letter, we see that very truth being affirmed, that Jesus was all. And Paul here, in almost all his letters, he's not just making a theological point, he's making a very practical one. And this is how it fits into the letter, that if Jesus is all, he's above all and before all and in all, then all of our focus as a church should be on him. That there's nothing else that can surpass him in importance in order to become some new focal point that would make us who we are as an assembly, as a church. And Paul does that, and he kind of makes it, I think, a catchword within the letter, because he uses that word all over the place. And we're going to actually see him use that later on in his concluding statement where we see all these threads come together. So right from the beginning, the church believed that Jesus was this God incarnate in the flesh who walked the earth, living out this special mission where he would lay his life down, this precious life, so that we could be connected to God, forgiven, and he would actually come and live inside every single one of us who believes in him. So he's not only all, but he lives in all. And so Paul continues explaining that a little bit later in Colossians 1:27. Here he writes, to them, God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now that term Gentile, we'll probably consider that a little bit later on. Real quick, that's an ethnic designation to separate Jews versus non-Jewish people. So it was a fence, it was this side versus that side. So he's getting into those issues of division here. And Paul's basically saying that Christ comes all the way into the lives of the people who were far off, who would never expect for him to come and connect to him. And so Paul here is definitely kicking down some fences that were really important in the first century, because what separated Gentiles from Jews was this issue of circumcision, this fence line, this religious rite that decided who was in and who was not in. And that issue of circumcision was one of the things that these false teachers were making very, very important and bringing that message to the church in Colossae. And we see that later on in the letter when Paul begins to address the issue with these teachers in chapter 2. So chapter 2, verses 8, he starts kind of going right at these guys, and he says, right, and he's writing to the church, but he's obviously addressing this issue. He says to the church, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy. So this is how he's describing the false teaching. Philosophy, empty deceit, according to human traditions, according to the element spirits of this world, and not according to Christ, right? That's the focus that Paul wants us to have. For in Christ is the whole fullness of deity dwelling bodily, and you have been filled in him who is the head and rule of all authority, and in him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. Now, here Paul is clearly addressing the issue going on with the church here, and this issue of this circumcision. You know, as believers in Jesus, do we have to go through this rite in order to be in the church? And Paul says, absolutely not. If your focus is on Jesus, all of that stuff has been fulfilled by Jesus on your behalf, and then in some spiritual way, you've been qualified with a circumcision that was done without hands, which is, if you don't know, the much less painful way to have that particular ritual fulfilled. And we're just going to leave it right there. The old ladies in Mississippi would be on my case right now, so we're just going to leave it right there. That's where that's going to stay. But Paul's point is absolutely clear. Jesus has to be the focus. Now, right here in chapter 2, up to my understanding of what this letter is all about, I would think this is pretty much it. I would say, wow, Paul, great letter. That's a wrap. You've pretty much said everything that you need to say. And I think a lot of us who have studied the Bible, maybe this is as far as we see this issue getting played out in this letter. Like, here's this false teacher. We got to focus on Jesus, not on all their stuff. Amen. We have a prayer and we head out. And I miss something that happens later on in the letter where he brings all of these things together and really drives it to a point that highlights what is the greatest threat to the church. And in case you haven't picked up the hint so far, I believe that what Paul is saying here is that the greatest threat to the church is division. It's taking these issues, these fences, and walking around looking suspiciously at other, like, do they believe like I believe, or do they not believe? Do they match up with what my expectation is, or do they not match up? Do they look the way that I expect them to look, or don't they? Do they agree with these theological issues that I have, or do they not agree with these theological issues? And so the greatest threat, probably the greatest, and I'll qualify it, practical threat to the church is the threat of division. And so Paul takes this beautiful letter and drives it home and makes one concluding statement that basically says that. Colossians 3:11, where he's in his final or next to final chapter, he says this. He says, here, meaning in the church, there is not Greek or Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. And so I read that and I was like, here is everything he said in this letter up to this point. Chapter 1, his whole point is Christ is all, right? We read, he's before and above and he made all things. And so he's all. And then because of the cross, he came down and now he's willing by faith to live by his Spirit in all. So here we see chapter 1 and then Christ is all and he's in all. And then chapter 2, that issue of circumcision, which was, again, the whole fence thing that these false teachers are coming along and saying, no, you have to do this if you really want to be part of the issue. And so Paul brings the whole thing to a conclusion by saying, no. Here in the church, None of those dividing lines matter anymore because we believe that Christ is all. And instead of using those issues to divide among ourselves, we're going to work hard to see Christ in all in this place as well. And so on this verse, he goes through all these fence issues in the first century, all these divisions. That's why he has contrasting statements here, right? So he goes through all of these typical ethnic and moral issues that are listed. So he says, here there's not Greek or Jew. That was a dividing line. Or here there's no circumcised or uncircumcised. That was another dividing line. So the Jews thought the Greeks were bad, and vice versa. And the Greeks thought the barbarians were ridiculous. These were the guys who lived way out on the outskirts of the first century. And both the Jews and the Greeks thought that the Scythians were these terrible people. So they all agree on one thing, which is that they didn't like this particular group. And then he throws in socioeconomic issues at the end, just in case we didn't realize he was talking about the things that typically divide a slave and free. But here, those things no longer matter because here we are a body of believers committed to making Christ all and working hard to see him alive in all. And so basically, Paul drives to my big idea right here in this final line, that our focus, not our fences, make Jesus' church. Now, that's a really kind of complicated argument. So let me just kind of explain this a little bit better. And I'm going to bring Jesus into the picture here because really interestingly, when Jesus had a moment to pray about the issues that he saw in the future of his church, he gives a really interesting prayer. In John 17, Jesus is coming towards the end of his ministry, and because he's God on earth, he can look down. He looks down the corridors of times at the kind of issues that are going to face the people who believe in him after the original 12 that he's addressing in that moment. And the one thing that Jesus prays for, the greatest threat that he sees happening to them, is a lack of unity. This is what he says. This is John 17. You probably heard this before, 20 through 21. And this is Jesus speaking. He says, I don't pray only for these, meaning only for his 12 that were physically in front of him at the time, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So that's you. If you think of it on down the line, that they may all be one. Just as you, Father, are in me and I am in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you've sent me. So startling that the one issue that Jesus picked out of all the things he could possibly pray for, and he prayed for other things, but this is the one highlighted here, that the church wouldn't pick up issues to divide about, but that they would be one. And through that, the world would be convinced that God really sent Jesus. Because I think a lot of times we think that the more divisive we get as a church, the better the world will realize how great Jesus is. The more number of issues we can be cantankerous about, the better the world is going to realize how deeply we believe. And yet Jesus says, nope, it's in your unity. And I'm not saying this because that we have any particular issues in C3. They're like, what's going on? Like, I'm just startled that this is how Paul ends his letter. And I think just given the general clamor and flavor of our culture right now, that this is what the church needs to hear. That fences and focusing on the fences only leads to one inevitable conclusion, which is that it divides us. And it's easy to see, the issue with shorts, right? The whole, there's some old school fences that the ladies at the Mississippi church were holding on to. And it wasn't just the shorts issue. Honestly, when we were working there, you could read through the old church covenant that this church had. And this was in 2000s, but it was listed in there, if you wanted to belong to that particular church, drinking, dancing, and I think even card playing was strictly out. Like no card playing, not even Uno. Like that was just straight from the devil. And so it's easy to look at those issues and be like, yeah, these are some outdated things that we use to divide, but what are the things that we're holding on to today that maybe we'd look back on several years from now and feel the same way about it? Because these fences do nothing for us except help divide us. Fences exist in order to define who's on one side of it versus who's on the other, who's in, who's out, who's good, and who's bad. And they preload us to walk around with a certain filter in our mind. We walk around with this filter, and when we encounter people, we say, well, do they agree with me with this, or do they agree with me on that? Are they on this side of this issue or of that? Because I have to know this issue about you in order to determine whether you're a worthwhile person for me to interact with. And we start walking around with these filters geared up from our fences, and we start judging others by them. And when we do that, we miss out on what God may be doing in their lives. Because Paul says here that the answer to all of these issues is a church that was willing to see that Christ is all and then work hard to see that he is also in all. That we would go around and instead of evaluating people by the filters that we have, we would work hard to see Christ at work in them. To find out what he's doing in their life, to see how he's putting grace and helping them take their next steps towards Jesus. And when we would do that, we would find reasons to encourage them on their journey of faith. Now, everybody's on a journey of faith in one way or another. Maybe their focus is on Jesus, and we can come alongside of them and help refine that focus as we also need our focus refined in him. And others may be journeying away from him. But we need to be the folks who work hard to see what is going on in their lives in order to better help them grow. This is a call to live above. That's what this whole series is about. Because down below, that's where the divisions exist. When we live down in the midst of the strife and the animosity and the hatred and the anger, that's the life down below. But the life that Jesus calls us to above is to call us to a perspective that he uniquely can see. Now, I know Paul never flew in an airplane, but it seems like in this letter, he describes a little bit of what that experience might be. If you've ever been up above, looking down through the little window, and you see people walking around, like everybody always says, oh, they just look like ants down there. Because from that perspective, it's impossible to make out who they are, or what the color of their skin is, or what they're wearing, or what they're doing, because we're looking at them from above. And it's not even just an issue of elevation. I mean, for any of us who have lived long enough, undoubtedly at some point you've looked back in your past and said, man, there were some things that for a long time I was really focused on. I thought that these were the main things in life. But now that I'm older, I don't even consider that stuff anymore. That's not even important to me. I remember getting a book a couple years ago that said, don't sweat the small stuff. I think it was really popular. Don't sweat the small stuff. And then the little caption underneath said, and it's all small stuff. And that's an experience that all of us can encounter sooner or later in life. That the longer we live, the more we realize what is truly important. And if we would, for a moment, consider the eternal perspective that Christ must have on his church and on the future of this world, how would that transform the way that we look at some of the things that we consider so very important? Because I don't think that as a church we'll ever grow in our appreciation for what Christ has done on the cross as long as we're focused on the little petty issues down below. You know, in this letter, almost every time Paul talks about the cross, he turns around and immediately begins to describe how far away we were when God brought us into reconciliation through this great cross. So one example here, and we've read this one in previous weeks, but notice what he says in Colossians 1:20 and 21. It says, "And through Jesus, God has reconciled to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you were alienated and hostile mind, doing evil deeds." He just turns around immediately because he can't talk about the height and the wonder and the amazing grace displayed at the cross without turning around and saying, remember how far away you were? Remember how low we were and Christ came to scoop us up. Remember the distance that he traveled in order to reconcile us to ourselves, to him. Because when we walk around feeling taller than each other, looking at issues that you may have or I might have, and somehow I feel better than you. If we walk around playing the comparison game all the time, then we have stopped seeing the skyscraper of the cross that stands above all of us. And from that perspective, all of those issues are nothing compared to what he has done for us. What he's done in order to make peace for us. You know, a lot of times we use fences to declare war on people who we don't like. We don't agree with them. We don't like what they're doing with our country. We don't like the way that they're doing this thing or that thing. And so we're declaring war on them. But the Jesus who died in order to make peace will never be honored by a church who lives to make war. Our focus, not our fences, make Jesus's church. And so let's consider how we can practically move in and making a step towards this vision that Paul gives us in this letter of what it means to be a church that sees Christ as all and in all. And this is a next step I would recommend that you consider how you can try to figure out and move forward with it this week. So take a moment and identify an issue that's been a real fence issue for you, something that you have felt very passionate about. Maybe it was one of the things that you wrote down or thought about as the greatest threat to the church. And take time and listen to someone who stands on the other side of that fence. Now, pick someone who you respect, because typically, when we're picking folks that we want to engage with on a particular issue, we pick the worst possible example of the other viewpoint and then feel really good about our perspective because we've basically picked a straw man. But pick someone who you respect, someone who could make an intelligent argument based off of things that you would listen to and agree with, and just give a listen to that other side. You may never change your mind on that issue. That's fine. But you just might change your tone. And that may make all the difference. May make all the difference. So to wrap up our Mississippi story, the pastor called me into his office and told me about the Shortsgate. Shortsgate. And I never actually told Amy about that conversation I had with him until now. No, I'm just kidding. Until much later. Because I just couldn't imagine her having to walk around thinking that people were looking at her with this filter. And, it probably wouldn't have bothered me too much because Amy's the real carer in our family. She's the one who makes those deep connections. I just, slough things off. But I knew it would hurt her, and it would hinder her ability to minister to these kids in our youth group who we were focusing on. And it just made me sad that instead of focusing on her focus, which was to bring Christ into the life of these teens and youth, that all they could see about her was this one particular issue. But we continued to minister to this youth group, and we can tell stories about how years later their parents would call us because one of their kids had gone missing, and they thought the only person in the world that could maybe reach out to this individual and connect with them would be us. And then a couple years later, this youth group actually, we moved up to Pittsburgh and started a church there. They actually did a mission trip to Pittsburgh. They shanghaied their new youth guy and took a trip up to Pittsburgh just to visit with us, but not really us. It was Amy. They wanted to see her again because of the kind of investment that she had made in their life. And unfortunately, that was something that those ladies never got to see. You see, beyond our fences is our future. The church that can live above, can sit where Christ seats. And that doesn't mean that we'd be a perfect church, and all of us need to have our focus on Christ refined. And that's why we exist for one another, to encourage each other to ever focus more deeply and perfectly on Him. And so we might have to have difficult conversations with one another in this journey, but when it's done from a perspective that Christ is all and He's in all, the tone and flavor of that radically changes. A church that can see from above sees that Christ is all and in all, and it becomes a place where our focus on Him, not our fences, make Jesus' church. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your amazing desire to reconcile all things to yourself, including us, that you'd be willing to send your Son down, God among us, to walk and live and display your amazing desire for peace and hope. And help us to make Him our perspective, our focus. And as we walk closer to Him, to lock arms with others around us, to help lift them up and to carry them forward, to make our focus on Him and not on what divides us, so that He can be glorified in His church and for all time. We pray in His name. Amen.
Please stand if you're able.